Hi, Wade. I was hoping you could briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your current role.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. My name is Wade Hasenour. I currently serve at Genovac as a regional sales manager. I cover Midwest, South, Southeast. My career began with a strong foundation in biochemistry. I worked in quality assurance in a lab. I moved through pharmacokinetics in a laboratory there as well. And then I transitioned into a sales role working for Shimadzu. I specialize in chromatography systems there. And then I joined Buki, where I managed an entire product portfolio. And then now, today at Genovac, which I focus mainly on centrifugal evaporation.
As you know, we spend a lot of time on here talking about chromatography and mass specs. Today, I was hoping we could talk about sample preparation. So I'm curious, what are some of the most significant changes or advancements you've observed in sample preparation throughout your career?
In sample preparation, what I've seen a lot transforming in our industry is robotics and automation. There's a higher focus on it. And these consultants have been hired in to say, okay, where in this workflow can we improve? Can we make it easier? Can we reduce the time in production of, let's say, whether it's an API or oligonucleotide? How do we improve this throughput to make us more profitable in a way? So chemists, while they're focusing on the quality of their work, the higher end business people are focusing on pushing through automation and more hands-off approach. So there's less liability when it comes to hurting someone or, let's say, exposing them to chemicals they shouldn't be seeing.
Time is money, certainly for commercial labs and a lot of our customers. So that makes all the sense in the world. I was hoping we could get into sample preparation techniques in general. I'm very familiar with nitrogen blowdown because that's really what Organimation specializes in. But I was hoping you could walk us through some of the basic principles of rotary evaporation, centrifugal evaporation, and freeze drying as well.
Sure. As a basis, the first thing you need to know is everything that you're doing, whether it's rotary evaporation, centrifugal evaporation, or freeze drying, is all centered around pressure control. That's the first step in understanding how the system works. The reason why is because when you reduce the pressure, it makes it easier to evaporate things off in a more gentle approach. So they all focus around that, and they all vary significantly in how much pressure you control. Because when you control that pressure, you can also control the temperature. So with rotary evaporation, the traditional method uses gentle heating through water, which is actually a great medium to transfer heat. So when it comes to the efficiency and how well it evaporates, water is a great middle ground between, like for instance, there's IR, there's water, there's a lot of different ways of heating your product. And using water actually causes it to evaporate faster rather than using, let's say, an IR lamp. So in this case here, rotary evaporation is focused on heating it through a water bath. It goes through the glass as it rotates to create that surface area, and that pressure helps reduce that overall temperature so that it evaporates out more gently and efficiently into a condenser. A condenser cools it down and goes into your final receiving flask. With centrifugal evaporation, it combines the same technology. The only difference is the vacuum goes down a little bit further. So for instance, if you have a really sensitive sample, like oligonucleotides, RNA, therapeutics, ADCs, peptide linkers, each one of these are particularly sensitive to temperature. So you reduce the pressure, the temperature can be like, let's say, 40 degrees Celsius at 8 millibar, and you have a simultaneous evaporation out of something like this. So instead of it being a glass container, you take like a falcon tube, stick it in here, and it evaporates many different samples at the same time. So it just makes it much more high throughput. It does take longer because a lot of these centrifugal evaporation systems use IR. It is much more gentler, but the time, it does take longer. So you can do many different samples at the same time. So when you break it down, rotary evaporation, it's very quick, very fast. And so you're like, well, how do you compare? You can only do one sample there. Whereas centrifugal evaporation, you can do hundreds of samples. So per sample, it comes down to time. So on the time scale per sample, it's actually faster on centrifugal evaporation. And so when I look at that, it's okay, that's pretty good to know. And you can use both of those two technologies within the three steps, whether it's synthesis, purification, or formulation, because they all dry down, right? Those two can dry down completely. And so with rotary evaporation, centrifugal evaporation, You'll see it commonly in synthesis, purification, and also in the formulation points as well. Whereas freeze drying, it's pretty great. It lowers the pressure so far that that it literally will turn into a powder almost right away. It takes time, but that's the whole purpose, is you lower the pressure so low that you can pretty much bring off any solvent and evaporate it off. That's the whole purpose. It could be trays, it can be sheets, it could be vials, it could be falcon tubes, it can be flasks. There are varying types of systems out there, and the whole purpose is literally to reduce the pressure to the point where it freezes the water and then pulls off the water from solid straight to gas. There's no liquid in between. And that's supposed to preserve the structure of the sample and keep it stable for shelf life or whatever type of formulation you're doing. And many times people refer to like eutetics or crystallization, the freeze drying process as well, because how you freeze it beforehand affects the crystallization of that actual product. So freeze drying is almost a different beast, but it's in the same exact category. You'll see it in the workflow. You'll see like a rotary evaporator on the synthesis. Then you'll do some type of solvent exchange. Let's say all these chemists are coming together, or all these molecular biology chemists. They're coming together using one system. They'll use a centrifugal evaporator. Then let's say they add or reconstitute, or let's say they concentrate something down and they'll add a little more solvent to something else. They'll pass that on to the freeze dryer. So it's like you see them all in the same lab for different applications, but they're all worthy within that same process. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's always been such an easy introduction to rotary to focus on how you're processing one sample at a time.
Yeah, that's something I see often, is that the transition is, okay, we have 4 chemists, each want their own rotary evaporator. They're doing 1 or 2 at a time. There's no real bottleneck when you're doing small volumes like that. And then with centrifugal evaporation, it's okay, we have now reached this level at which we have a bottleneck in the workflow. There's so many samples built up behind it. Now centrifugal evaporation becomes the solution. Or let's say in certain situations like harsh solvents like DMSO, for instance, rotary evaporation doesn't do very well with that. It bumps super easily. Whereas centrifugal evaporation, that technology, it uses centrifugal force or gravity to help keep it from boiling out or bumping. And so that's also another key component of centrifugal evaporation, is the centrifugal part. So while we're focusing on, like I said, our high throughput, one thing to it, it adds extra gravity to prevent that boiling from happening at the top and bumping and cross-contaminating. So that's a key component there. Whereas in rotary evaporation, if you had high boiling point solvents, you would tend to not be able to evaporate it off, or you'd have trouble keeping it from losing that analyte. And that's the whole purpose of evaporation, is to preserve that analyte. That is the whole purpose of everything you're doing. So when you hear the word bumping, people think it's sacrilegious. They're like, what? Losing my sample? What? Destroy? What? I don't understand. Reduce my yield? I can't do that. I can't do that today. So yeah, the whole purpose is to be as gentle as possible, and when you evaporate things off, to hopefully not get that analyte to go along with it.
And I know you touched on this, but I'd be curious, do you have any other notes on whether it's efficiency, sample integrity, or cost effectiveness, and how the different factors impact those three different techniques?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a sales guy now, not from the scientific side of it, the first thing I have to ask my clients, and it comes off rude sometimes, even though I'm a nice guy, I try to gently walk into it. But the first thing you have to talk to people about is cost effectiveness. That is the first thing. Like, okay, how much are you budgeting here? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to do large scale, small scale? What is your attempt? Because rotary evaporation can be benchtop, but it can also be scaled to an industrial size. Whereas with centrifugal evaporation, I don't know how many people will buy warehouse size centrifugal evaporator, right? So in this case, that's the first question you got to ask, is what is your purpose of your project? So to me, cost effectiveness is the first question you have to get into with your clients. If they say, I only have 5,000, I'm sorry, the only solution you can get is a rotary evaporator. So it's one of those things where you ask the question about the cost. Then the next question is, to me, what is your application? And so if they say, solvent wise, I want to use DMSO, or I want to use some type of low boiling point solvent. If you're focusing on one particular solvent, I'd say the most efficient solution for you would be rotary evaporation because it's quick, it's easy, and for low boiling point solvents, it comes off pretty quick. Whereas unless you're doing, let's say, 100 samples, then I'd say you need to go something more high throughput because you can't do more than one sample on a rotary evaporator. Then it comes down to freeze drying, even spray drying, and then also centrifugal evaporation. And then aside from cost effectiveness, we have to talk about sample integrity. How do you maintain that sample integrity? And I think that things that are much gentler by reducing the pressure significantly. It doesn't denature your protein, it doesn't denature your product, doesn't break down your product. So freeze drying and centrifugal evaporation really focus on reducing that pressure to protect those temperature sensitive compounds. While rotary evaporation can sometimes, I'm not gonna say every time, but can sometimes compromise the delicate nature of these samples. So if someone's like, oh, my sample denatures at 50 degrees Celsius, I'm like, maybe rotary evaporation is not the best choice. The pressure can't get down far enough for some of these products. Some of these solutions, some of these things like rotary evaporation, you can't get the pressure down far enough. And so the temperature, it denatures your product, even because your solvents are much higher than your actual sample is. So how do you evaporate it off without destroying the sample or taking the analyte with you? And then that comes down next to efficiencies. Okay, if you have something quick or you don't have a lot of time and you only have a few samples, the best is to use a rotary evaporation. Genovac does have a rocket. It's for low boilers to high or low to mid boiling point solvents, and that uses water also to transition the heat from the system to the sample. And I think that's very effective. So like rotary evaporation, that's all they do is they transition the temperature from the system to the sample through water. So I think if you're looking for efficiency, like fast wise, the fastest solution is any evaporation technology that focuses using water as the heating transition. So rotary evaporation is the biggest market share of that particular area. But there are other technologies. The rotary evaporation probably is best in terms of quick. But if you say, okay, I have 1,000 samples, maybe it's actually better for you to do centrifugal evaporation. So that's what it comes down to, and I know it's a long-winded answer, but in reality, it becomes a long conversation with some of my clients because I need to understand what is their priority. Is it cost saving? Is it the integrity of the sample, or is it maybe the throughput of the product?
It's a complex answer for sure when you're trying to factor in all these different factors, for lack of a better, and you have all these different potential solutions. So yeah, it's an area where having a good salesperson like yourself on your side trying to help you navigate through everything is super important. And you and I met on a trade show floor. I'm always amazed by some of the size of those really gigantic, not benchtop rotary evaporators.
Yeah,
If you've never seen one before, you're like, have no concept that this even existed.
it's a bit intimidating when you saw it too. Probably you're like, what is this going to do? Take me back in time? Like, where am I going, Doc Brown? So, so I totally get it. You looked over and I saw you. I'm like, what is this? Like,
We had our at that show. It was our S-Evap evaporator that holds the large flask. So we had either the 250 mil or the 500 mil.
Yep.
Yeah, that's very specific for EPA method. Argued it is spec'd into some of the 8,000 series EPA methods. So you're taking the sample from that large scale and then getting it down to what I always call, for lack of a better term, test tube size. And then we're doing
Yeah.
nitrogen flow down from there, whether it's to dryness or to get it down to yet another vial size, like a GC vial, each mil.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I told you this too. Like in our systems, we have these things called sample genies, and they do something very similar, where it's like you evaporate it down, and it's like in a flask at the top, and then underneath there's a little tiny 2 mil GC vial, and so you evaporate it like anything else, and then it just sucks it down and concentrates it down into this 2 mil.
That's so cool.
I know it's crazy what people come up with. There's some technology out there that no one's even used yet, but it's pretty great. I already know it.
Making progress all the time. Again, you touched on this, but do you have any other notes on what types of samples or analytes are best suited for the general concentration methods?
What's best suited? A lot of Are you talking about in terms of the technique like rotary evaporation versus centrifugal evaporation versus freeze drying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so best suited for each. I would say when I hear things like APIs and organic synthesis, the most common solution is rotary evaporation. That I hear that all the time. When it comes to like mixed solvents, something very temperature sensitive, something high throughput, drug screening, RNA therapeutics, oligonucleotide synthesis, diagnostic reagent kits. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but in those well plates, as we talked about several times, like doing throughput on higher amounts of those well plates is very useful in diagnostics. So I would say centrifugal evaporation is pretty great for that. And then freeze drying is more like biological samples, analytes requiring like stability for long periods of time. That would be the best solution for those. Whereas, like, let's say rotary evaporation, centrifugal evaporation, you have a next step right away. Whereas freeze drying, you have now purified and you have now made it stable so you can store it. I'd say that's probably what I see them most for. But again, like nitrogen blowdown also is part of those solutions as well. And in terms of what's ideal, it really depends. But I see those three specifically in those like rotary evaporation APIs are a dead ringer. Centrifugal evaporation, you're talking RNA therapeutics, oligonucleotides, diagnostics, medicinal chemistry. Like that's the dead ringer there. And then freeze drying, you're now in formulation stage or you're trying to store it. Maybe you're trying to make a library of options and candidates. I don't know. They're biological samples, peptides, or analytes requiring long-term stability. That's the dead ringer for freeze drying.
From a sales perspective, one thing I see a lot is that for new customers, someone who hasn't used an organimation product in the past, we're more trying to convince people who are applying nitrogen blowdown, who are doing it by hand or through a homemade system, to use our equipment for that rather than trying to get someone to move away from any of the other existing technologies we talked about. We're actually, through the end of January, we have a contest going for the most creative homemade solution. And we're actually going to give away a free evaporator to what we deem as the most impressive, creative homemade solution because, yeah, it's really generating the awareness that if you're doing it by hand without heat, and if you have any sort of scale, you'd be much better off with
Yeah.
spending the $5,000 to $10,000 on a product rather than just being able to do, let's say it's 4 samples at a time, drying it
Yeah.
down with nitrogen without heat.
That's a very interesting competition. I hope you send out the photos.
Yeah, yeah, no, I like it from a lot of different angles, and certainly just bringing awareness to there's a lot of people out there we could help and save time, and
hmm
I'm excited to see how it goes as more people send in photos. And
You should make a collage. I'd be interested to see their homemade setups.
yeah, no, I will certainly do that on LinkedIn, I think, and get all those photos out there. But I was hoping you could touch on some challenging sample preparation scenarios you've encountered where it's been tough to figure out what the best solution was and what ended up happening, if any stories come to mind.
There's I think it's always the same story, to be honest. There's a couple where it's DMSO isn't drying down. That's where we come in and we try to save the day and we have to customize a solution. There's two groups that I think are the most common where people struggle, and that's oligonucleotides, RNA therapeutics. And the reason why I say that is because I work with customers that synthesize these oligonucleotides and they worry about cross contamination because we do have a competitive technologies. Innovac has competitive technologies out there that the gravitational amount on these samples actually isn't high enough. And so you'll have these weld plates and they will cross contaminate in the evaporation process. So you get these very light, I'll say low boiling point solvents and these very hard to get off high boiling point solvents. And the question is always the same. Can you prevent this cross contamination? And at the same time, can you solve another problem? Can you prevent it from degrading? We introduce our systems as Genovac systems as these anti-bumping, gentle evaporators, effectively. We also add on things like inert gas purging, And the reason why that's useful is because when people are using diethyl ethers and extractions and whatnot, then we can prevent them from making their systems explode. So I'd say they're all in the same group where, DMSO doesn't come off. And I find that either DMF or NMP, and people are just trying to get as much off as possible to go on to the next step. So it's a solution for consistency, for a higher variety of product. So you can do low boiling points to high boiling point solvents, and you can prevent degradation of their samples when they're really sensitive. So I think that's the one I see the most is they're like, we're trying to do more samples faster. And I'm like, you can do more samples, and it depends on how fast your prior technology is. If you're saying you're doing one rotary evaporator for this and it's coming off in 2 minutes, I can't do 100 samples in 2 minutes, but I can do 100 samples where it takes me less per sample. So the most challenging sample preparation scenario is almost every time because we fine tune it with them and we give them a solution that they're like, okay, which solvent do we use? And I said, well, you tell me, like, what have you been using? What is more effective? You guys are the ones in the lab. So you become more of a consultant. And so the challenging position is actually understanding their process. I'd say more than even their chemistry. So tell me, what solvents are you using? How long is it taking you? And I can tell you if we can do this better or prevent that sample from degrading. I don't know if I went around the question, but I feel like that's the challenging part is actually getting the right information from the client. And they have a lot to offer too. They're really smart. So if you don't know something, majority of the time they'll tell you. They'll say, "Hey, look, this is the right answer. This is how we do it. This is how you should probably do it." And there's been 3 or 4 instances my company has actually worked with the client to create something for them. And so I think the challenging part isn't the science. It's actually the relationship. And if you need to have people trust you. You know how that works. But effectively, if you're going in and you're telling them how their work is going to work, then most of the time you're going to lose them. Not necessarily the sale, but just that relationship you can kindle together to create their work, to make it easier for them. I think the most challenging part really is that relationship.
I agree with all of the above. Value the relationship and also the idea that you're analyzing a current process. That's something we've worked to develop some of the tools on our website to figure out what are the basic parameters of the main process now. And we expect to be able to generate a meeting group. Usually that's in terms of time saved versus how the work's done right now. One thing I see with research labs is their research is derived from an EPA method, and then they've made changes based on the work they're trying to do. As you might be able to guess, some of those modifications that they've made have resulted in some of their sample preparation not going as well as it probably is if you're doing the method by the book, where it's been very tested and standardized, obviously. So that's another thing that I'm seeing more and more of.
Yeah, completely. I completely understand where you're coming from because it's like some people will modify their methods if they aren't directly, let's say, if they're not directly standardized by a certain group, they'll 100% alter that method. So understanding why they did it, how has this helped you? Is the question I like to ask sometimes. Is tell me how has this ended up helping you? Because sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does, and sometimes it's unique to see the outcome. So I totally get it. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from.
And luckily for us, where I sit, because they referred to the standardized method, it might list a piece of organimation equipment. So then they're coming to you for help, whether they've purchased a product or they're doing the research and saying, hey, maybe you guys know about this, and then we can try and help them the best we can. What advice would you give to chromatographers who are just starting to explore different sample preparation techniques?
Yeah. I'll say something that's not sample preparation related first. And I say this because every time when I used to sell chromatography systems, every time I'd talk to them, they'd try to be using things that are immiscible. Yeah, and I'm like, hey, this is gonna lock up your chromatography system. So please check the miscibility charts. And some of them would have it right then and there, but I'm like, it'll lock up your chromatography systems and you're not going to be able to use anything for a long period of time. So don't slow yourself down. But in sample preparation, I think understand your analyte. What is the boiling point? Know its reactivity, and also what is the stability of your sample. So choose a method, I think, based on your needs and the sensitivity of the samples themselves. And don't hesitate to leverage like automation, because that's what companies are doing right now. That's what you're seeing, is that they're trying to reduce the workload by consultants coming in saying, hey, look, this workflow here specifically, you're heavily invested in time, but don't get any actual work done. So don't hesitate right now as chromatographers and you're doing sample prep. Don't hesitate to take up the automation tools they're offering you, because that's going to give you job security. It's going to give you reliability, and it's also going to make you be able to focus on the things that are more important to you. For instance, doing the actual synthesis. Don't hesitate to rely on automation. Just do your best to be on the lookout and take advantage of the opportunities given to you.
That's a great answer. You mentioned consultants. Are there any
Mm.
other resources or tools that are top of mind for someone doing research in this area in terms of what processes they should use?
Yeah, so a lot of companies, they try to help. Shimadzu, Genovac, Buki. They have a lot of really helpful resources like application notes. And then additionally, webinars, online platforms like Coursera. Sometimes they'll have specifics on it, but chromatographers probably not. I know LCGC is a magazine, and also they have an online presence where they teach the basics of chromatography as well as some more advanced applications of it. In the shed over here, I have all my undergraduate instrumental analysis books. So I'm like, a lot of times people are like, oh, I need modern, I need modern. But honestly, there's not a lot of these massive books these days that are online. You can't find them on Amazon.com, Kindle, but you can find them on like in paperback books. So I'd say do that. Lean on professional organizations like ACS. They offer a lot of valuable insights and a lot of networking opportunities. And then, of course, peer-reviewed articles and other instrumentation forums and just people in general around them. Don't be afraid. I think that's one thing chemists and chromatographers have a hard time doing, is leaning on each other, because they're very private people.
Yeah, and that's something I'm hoping to do with more of these video interviews, because you meet a lot of researchers who are interested in sharing what they're doing, but outside of a poster or oral presentation at something like ACS, there's not really a place for them to continue talking about their work. I feel like it's a little bit of one and done almost, where it's, oh, this is the final poster, and I go and present it, and then it's done with. So being able to also share those stories with more people, it's not, oh, if you didn't attend that 2 hour window at this conference and this video,
Right? Yeah.
like it's just gone forever.
Yeah.
Although it is nice to see that some more of those posters and things are available online. And I guess that's one of the advantages to that hybrid conference format, is that it's easier to get to some of that information and have it archived rather than just, if you weren't there, you missed out.
Yeah, my brother is actually a research professor at Vanderbilt. And so when I talk to him, I'm like, hey, how often do you talk to other people? He's like, all the time. And I'm like, great. I'm like, how often outside of your own organization? He reaches out quite a bit, to be honest, but that's a very rare find. I've been around a lot of, let's say, biological chemists or biochemists and molecular biologists, and when you talk to them, they're very private, and they try not to waste time on reaching out to people that it doesn't come to fruition. I still think if they go out there and they really put themselves out there and they network, it's going to be very useful for them.
I totally agree. And then we talked about automation, and that might be a main part of your answer, but how do you see sample prep techniques evolving over the coming years?
You're going to see more and more systems that are more compact and whatnot. But I also see AI and automation playing a much more significant role throughout the chemist workflow. I've already seen robots take samples off of an RNA synthesizer and then from that RNA synthesizer, take that over to the evaporation table. And then I saw it evaporate. And then I've seen another robot where it literally takes it out and puts it into an evaporator. I see AI and automation taking on a much more thorough role going forward, because that's not even the biggest workflow process that takes up time. Think about, let's say, cleaning the glassware or labeling the glassware, or let's say reconstitution. If you're trying to it depends on your workflow, but effectively, there's so many small components of each benchtop that if you could just reduce one, it would play a significant role in helping your throughput. So I would say that these new innovations, they're definitely streamlining all the workflows out there, and then they're making it still compliant, less error prone. So let's say, did I put 5 microliters in there? How many did I put in there? I don't know. So it's like, that's another error too, is that just human error. And that's not a problem to say, okay, now I'm expanding my skill to actually do the synthesis, and this lab is now automatically doing it for me. And then I can reconfirm the outcome as well. There's other analytical tools post-synthesis and formulation that people can become much more knowledgeable on. So I'd say that's probably what I see a lot in sample preparation, is more robotics and more AI. And it may sound cliche, it's coming.
I suppose, like anything with the argument for automation and AI in general, you can read any number of articles talking about the high degree of error being introduced to the process through the sample preparation step. So there's certainly that built-in argument of more automation leading to fewer errors.
Yeah, I used to say PSIC error, and they're like, what is PSIC error? I said, person sitting in chair. That's the thing too, you gotta think about, is that I've made a lot of errors when I was working in the lab all the time. They're like, what makes up for this extra ethanol peak or this sulfate peak? Like, why is there more of it here? And I'm like, I don't know, but it's probably me. I probably did it. Yeah, so to me, I'm like, that's what I'd say. Its foundation to sample prep is literally just consistency and reliability.
I agree. In closing, is there anything else you'd like to share regarding the importance of sample prep and chromatography?
I would say just give it a little thought to choosing the right technique. Doing that, like, not only makes you achieve your goals faster, but also opens doors for like innovation and more complex analyses. So it's like, for me, like I mentioned this several times, it's the sample prep is the foundation for reliable outcomes, and ensuring consistency and optimizing your workflow is going to be key to that.
Awesome, Wade. I really appreciate the time today. Thanks for speaking with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun, and I honestly don't get to talk this much about it, and I'm really happy because I'm something I'm passionate about too. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.